Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin, eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. I got another 6 album roundup for you. This is kind of preview music for 2021, all new music. It's going to kind of introduce us to a whole new cast of characters. It's an annual thing. It happens every year, and it's always very exciting. And there's a lot of music to get through, so let's go and get started. The first one is Caroline Eyck and Eversigns, the Waves LP. Caroline Eyck is a theremin player, and this is an album that's just her with this producer who goes by the name Eversigns. All the sounds in the album were created with just a theremin and Caroline Eyck's voice. And if you know anything about the theremin, it's this very interesting early 20th century electronic instrument, one of the first electronic instruments. And it's an instrument that you don't touch when you play it. It's just your hands interacting with kind of radioelectric waves. A very, very difficult instrument to play. It's very, very sensitive, especially if pitch is a consideration. But Caroline Eyck has a lot of training and has studied the instrument really closely and diligently. So she has a great mastery of the instrument. And Eversigns recorded various performances of hers in the studio into Ableton, and then just kind of looped them around and turned them backwards and forwards and transmorgified them into a whole different textures. And the end result is absolutely mesmerizing. I love this album very much. I've always been very fascinated by the theremin. It's another in a long line of odd instruments that I've taken an interest in. And it's a very interesting approach to the instrument. It's a very cool application of Ableton. And the album has all these fascinating, like, kaleidoscopic uses of the theremin. Things go backwards and forwards, and the way she samples her voice on top of it. There's not really lyrics throughout the album. It's all instrumental. Even though she uses her voice on it, it's all just her singing little melodic fragments and textures that go along with the theremin and create this really fantastic soundscape. So the Waves LP was kind of a surprise hit for me. Love it. Love this album a lot. So next up is Jeremy Cunningham's The Weather Up There. Jeremy Cunningham is a jazz musician, arguably. His background is in jazz, who played straight ahead jazz for quite a while, meaning that he would go play standards and that sort of thing. And he was doing this for a while in Chicago and eventually branched out into the kind of a wider Chicago scene and got hooked up with a bunch of other kind of experimental, out-of-the-box type musicians and started playing this kind of interesting mix of rock and jazz and almost like post-jazz rock. It kind of feels like post-rock the way that the Tortoise is post-rock. It has that same kind of feel to it. So it's a very improvisational nature to this and very jazzy, but I wouldn't really necessarily call it a jazz album, even though it really has a strong instrumental aspect to it. What really defines this album to me and really makes it stand out is that it's a concept album that Jeremy Cunningham wrote about the death of his brother. His brother, Andrew, was killed in a home invasion incident. It's a pretty scary and brutal way to go as he tells the story. But the album doesn't directly deal with that as much as it deals with the fallout from that. He has these field recording style narratives on there that are people who knew his brother Andrew, who are close to him, and talk about how his passing affected them. And when you put that against the backdrop of this music, it has this really, it gives the music a really great depth of gravitas and emotional depth to it that the music by itself, although, it is an emotional album, has a lot of passionate performances on it. These performances are made more emotionally charged by these narratives. And they're kind of by people who knew him, moms and brothers and sisters-in-laws and things like that. And it's something that Jeremy Cunningham obviously put a lot of thought into. He feels very passionately about it. It's a very honest and revealing album about Jerry Cunningham. If you know that about him and the amount of himself and his own emotional energy that he invested in the making of the album, it makes it that much more of a great experience to listen to. Next up is Photay's Waking Hours. Fote is the nom de plume of Evan Shormstein. Evan Shormstein is an electronic musician who's released one album before this one. This is his second album as Fote. In some interviews surrounding this album, Evan Shormstein had said that it's almost like there's nothing more countercultural and more almost rebellious that you can do in today's culture than to just slow down and kind of take a meditative moment to appreciate things. It's a very electronic album for sure, and it definitely has a placid feel to it. There are vocals on it, which I believe is unusual for Fote. This project, his previous album, was mostly instrumental. He kind of veers into some pop songwriting on this. That's also pretty well done. It's a very experimental record in lots of ways, lots of unusual sounds that he uses, but nothing so far out that it feels completely alien. It's not an album that's confrontational or stands away from you. It's very inviting, despite the fact that it has really a lot of non-traditional sounds on it. He not just electronically, he pulls in like kora players and has sort of these Latin flavors that show up from time to time, but ultimately it coheres really well under his vision.
I've had the honor of listening to your story. I found a question, and I like your point of view. Now that you found it, is it right for you?
I'm of the mind that when I listen to this album, it reminds me of like this weird cross between like the Dirty Projectors and Thomas Dolby. Okay, next up is Disabledcuss, which is the debut album from the guitarist from Terra Milos. Nick Reinhardt is his name. Nick Reinhardt has a very wide palette of projects that he has himself involved in. As a guitar player, he's involved in experimental like psychedelic music and noise and math rock. But Disabledcuss is more of a pop songwriting project. And as such, it's interesting diversion for him, who's a person who has generally taken a lot more adventurous turns in his songwriting. He really kind of sticks in this album to a pretty standard verse, chorus, verse style format. And it feels like it has a real nostalgic angle towards the 90s in it. A lot of Weezer sounds come out of this album. Early Weezer, maybe first, second album. Not quite the songwriting that happens in those albums, but definitely that kind of wall of guitar sound and direct songwriting that you get on those albums definitely are there, along with other bands like that, Nirvana and Dinosaur Jr., that whole kind of early 90s rock, grunge, pop slate of artists. I think that's what he's drawing a lot of his inspiration from this album.
Spits out colors found deep in a rainbow. Where she got them from, no one knows. She's odd, she's odd, she's odd. So what, so what, so what?
One thing about this album that kind of puts me ill at ease to a degree is it feels very dynamically flat. The whole album is pretty much all, if I was going to put it in musical terms, all pretty much mezzo forte, like comfortably strong. But it still has a lot of hooks, and it still kind of bears the mark of Reinhardt's adventurous nature, kind of just brimming right below the surface if you know to listen for it. Next up is Jonathan Scales' Pillar. And I discovered Jonathan Scales last summer whenever I started kind of doing investigations of experimental black music. And it started just with an inquiry I put out through social media. Jonathan Pillar is, in many ways, a very impressive, boundary-pushing experimental black artist in his own way. He's a steel pan player that plays like cross-genre jazz. He definitely follows in the footsteps of like Bela Fleck and that whole mindset. But what his big innovation is his real mastery over the steel pans, his incredible technique, and also his compositional skills. And I think the compositional aspect of what he does is really important to him because he's put out pretty detailed sheet music, books of sheet music for these charts. So writing the music is another aspect of the Jonathan Pillar Fourchestra, as he calls himself, like the number 4 Fourchestra, that adds to his innovative aspect. It's not just that he's playing this kind of broad, stylistic version of improvised jazz, but that he has a lot of technique and a lot of really great compositional ideas that he embeds in his music. Also, it's kind of hard not to listen to this album and kind of think of Jaco Pastorius' debut album, because his super classic debut from the mid-70s was using a lot of steel pans in it and such a distinctive sound. The bass player for Jonathan Pillar is also he's definitely a post-Jaco bass player. Not super busy, but definitely has that feel, has a lot of melodic components to his voice. So it's hard for me not to kind of think of that album. And finally, Mr. Bungle's The Raging Wrath of the Easter Bunny EP. So it was a big news this year that Mr. Bungle was releasing a new album. Mr. Bungle has always been a group that has tried to confound expectations, whether it be from minute to minute in their own piece or from one album to the next. There's always a surprise waiting in store. Rather than take a chance with writing new music and having it not go as well as maybe they planned, instead they almost became their own cover band. By going back and digging up their EP that they wrote when they were in high school, playing as a band in high school as a thrash band, and reworking it in a contemporary framework, a contemporary production situation. Not exactly what I expected from Mr. Bungle, which is exactly what Mr. Bungle wanted. I think on this album, they're really trying to confound expectations and keep themselves from having to be compared from what they've already done by doing something completely different, but that is still them. So conceptually, I've got to respect where they're coming from on it. And I do think it's a very well executed thrash album. It's kind of shaken up so many core ideas about what I felt about the band, because I walked into the album, even though it's been 20 years, I walked into the album with a pre-existing idea about what Mr. Bungle was and what they were gonna do. So I'm still wrestling it to the ground, but it's a very impressive piece of work. It's properly disturbing. And it's I think, a pretty interesting re-recording of some of these songs, and pretty honest in some cases. I really do appreciate that they got some new members in Mr. Bungle and have accepted them as members in the band, and including like the core members of Trevor Dunn and Mike Patton. They also have Guy Lombardo on drums and Scott Ian from Anthrax playing guitars. They really gave themselves a pretty deep thrash cred on that stuff to execute it in the style properly. So I am very impressed with this album in many ways. I'm still trying to decide if that being impressed by is the same as loving it, like I love so many of the other Mr. Bungle albums. But again, the second and third spins that I had on the album were more revealing, and it may be one that has to be kind of a grower. So we'll see in the long run how it pans out. But it's definitely an interesting addition to the Mr. Bungle history. And that's all I got for you guys this week for this roundup. I have probably 2 or 3 more of these coming out, so I hope that you enjoy them. If you like them, please like and subscribe and share it out with your friends. I'm adding these tracks over to my Spotify 2021 radio list. So check that out. And until I see you next time, I'll catch you on the flip side.